Even as a youth, Dada and I, we wanted to be the biggest sound system in the world. And it was more or less having the plot. How are you going to do that? I guess Soul to Soul in its entirety could have only happened here in London. And that was because of that level of innovation and creativity that exists around these concrete pillars. Put your ideas out there, be open-minded, and just believe that collectively you'll gain a lot more than you would as an individual.
I'm Adrian Sykes, and this is Union Black, an online multi-format content series across YouTube and Google Arts and Culture, featuring a curated collection of videos, audio documentaries, podcasts, stories, and photographs. Each series takes us on a journey celebrating the contributions of Black British music artists, creatives, professionals, and scenes. Told by the Black British music community, these stories will demonstrate the undeniable influence and impact of Black British music and culture in the UK and beyond. Go check out all the Union Black content on Google Arts and Culture at goo.gle/Union Black. The Black British Producers Behind Global Album series is a piece of 4 visualised podcasts that will spotlight a cross-generation of Black British music producers who've had international impact. Welcome to Union Black, the Black British Producers Behind Global Albums, and it is my absolute pleasure and honour to introduce the one, the only, the legend that is Jazzie B, OB. Jazzie?
Well, go on.
I'm good, my friend. How are you? Are you well?
Everything is everything.
We kind of warmed up with a little something at the top of this. But clearly, when we talked about doing this series, there was no doubt that your standing, what you've given to Black British music, what you've given to Black British culture, you were someone that we had to have in this conversation. So I really want to kind of talk to you about your journey, your life, and all the other bits and pieces around it about Black British culture and what's made you and what made Soul to Soul. So let's go back to the beginning. What took you or attracted you to music in the first place?
I guess as a West Indian, growing up in a household, my brothers having sound systems, music was always part of the daily diet, whether it was listening to Lou Rawls or some other country and western thing on a transistor radio against the backdrop of what was happening in the living room where only the elite could go. But the Gram would be playing, particularly on the weekend. That would be just on all the time. So there's loads of things, my earlier influences were anything from Benny and the Jets to Desmond Dekker and Millie Smalls, right through to, Dennis Brown, anything coming out of Studio One, etc., to the point of about mid-70s, as a teenager trying to find your tribe. Things changed a little bit.
I mean, we're getting to the tribe thing, but you not only found your tribe, you created one. You created a whole movement and a sound and an ethos that lives to this day and is still very prevalent in the UK. But you talk about your 10 siblings, your siblings. How influential were they to you in as you were growing up and your formative years in music?
Well, your brothers and your sisters, you know what I mean? So anything from hand-me-downs to the kind of suckling that you would do, And as a kid growing up, it's, there's no agenda, So, mum and dad are out at work and whatever, and your older brothers and sisters are almost like in that spot. So you're being inspired and so on and so forth. And they're the people who I looked up to growing up. So it was an interesting time during the 70s, because I think much like what we're going through now, this shift, it was kind of like that in the 70s. So anything from the 3-day week to, the Greeks and stuff like that coming over, a lot of the Indian people coming over during the 70s, and that little time of unsettledness in our society, in our community, and we've gone from Labour to a Conservative, and the interesting time probably was post the Falkland War.
Really?
Because that's when all the technology, and I think there was a bit more of a political shift. Again, creating, our ideology, which loosely would have been based around the attitude of punk. I'm growing up here in London, right around the corner. Do you know what I mean? All these, this area in Soho was like a part and parcel of our nook and crannies. Anywhere from the market all the way through, down to Bond Street. But the point I'm making there is that London was a really interesting place, which allowed us to be that innovative and creative through the resources that existed. So again, growing up, I would have been surrounded by all these things, you know what I mean, and tempted. It was lots of colours growing up in the backdrop of, foggy London, Rag and Bone Man, Paraffin Man, you know what I mean? Scrap yards, adventure playgrounds, Black Power, the Muslims, oh, mate. It was just an interesting time coming up, and all of those things and above, against the backdrop of church, which was more like a babysitting club, because, that was the only time parents got you out of the house for a couple of hours and that lot. The linkage that you made then, that would be setting the tracks for you growing up. So the whole idea of rebellion and school and the structure, and I guess really importantly, which I think a few of us miss, we were growing up in a class society.
100%.
The 14 bus was how I managed to get around as even a youth sound, and that was because members of our community worked on the buses. Members of our community worked in the hospitals. Members of our community had apprenticeships at places like Plessy before BT, and things like that. You could go, you could take your experimental ideas and go a little bit further, end up at Edgware Road, Henry's or RTVC to buy your components, go back to school where you were in your woodwork or metal workshops, building my preamp, building my speakers and stuff like that. These are all like part and parcel of the things, and that was what was interesting and great, alongside we call it recycling now, but we used to call it hand-me-down.
That's right. And also being incredibly resourceful, as you say.
Oh,
because, the one thing that you and I will know is that what there wasn't a lot of was spare cash.
And, and some of us were smart and apt to the point of a tin of teacup can do a lot of work. And, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking
I know
about.
what you're talking.
So those days were fantastic days, you know what I mean? Polishing brogues, stay pressed Levi's. This is the kind of world I grew up in, and then moving on to Farah's and then taking another step inside of all of these things with your identity, trying to land your own. Against the backdrop of, like I said, your friends who would have been Indian, Irish, massive Irish community I grew up with, Greek as well, and all of us standing together on this sort of like platform of, the idea of being working class and the whole class system, and the glass wall in terms of one's intention and where you could go to where you were supposed to go in terms of, where the Commonwealth had us. And you start growing up. Some of us start reading to the end of the book. Some of us start, instead of bringing stones and batons to the riot, some of us start bringing towels and water. You know what I mean? And understanding that, the way that the sound have to run, the equipment has to be up to scratch. Someone has to drive the van. Look after the door. We have to get the right. So the sound system and the way I grew up was always collective, and the resources from the sound system fed a lot of people in my community.
Let's go back and talk about your early introduction into the world of sound system and your first sound, which was Jarika, right? Mm-hmm. And you and Dada kind of out there doing that. I mean, you were a teenager at that point, right? Kind of like
All right. So really,
Big-
to set the picture, my first paying gig was 1977, the Queen's Silver Jubilee.
yeah,
Again, you know, talking about the community and us being in our place. You know, we do mention the fact that it takes a community to raise a child, and my community helped to raise Soul to Soul, and all the things that come from it kicked off there, right there in the heart of my community. Suppose that I would have been privileged to be at christenings, the odd wedding reception, funerals, and so on. But, you know, probably more importantly, church and the church outings, which again was an extension of the community, a platform, and where maybe I did get a bit of sense realising that if I sold a coach worth of tickets, these people would become what is called nowadays subscribers.
right.
And we used to call that followers back in the day. And then being able to divvy up the money for the coach against the tickets was always another challenge, because everybody wants a freebie. So that's how we were able to find out different ways of every mickle make a muckle. So if you
I've
live
not had that for a long time. I've not had that for
you
the
know,
longest
you're doing
time.
some kind of work like that. These were the kind of things that helped to shape it, and within that we had the spirit of the Holy Ghost and church, etc., against the rebellion and backdrop of why we were there, and making good a situation as we possibly could, you know. And I think that was the start of what they call entrepreneurialism and so on and so forth. In our eyes, that's a sound thing, because I had to find a way of being able to monetize the fact that, you know, we had these ideas and things going on, but rent had to pay, and we needed money to give mum.
Pay your food, pay your
pay
rent.
your way, you know.
I mean, one of the things that we've known each other for a long time. I didn't really know you until Africa Centre, and we'll get to that. But one of the things I've always been hugely impressed by, and kind of going back and looking at your story, was that true entrepreneurial spirit. And some people look at it and kind of go, you know, they see this later down the shops, but, you know, that entrepreneurial spirit was something that's always been within you. It's always fueled what you've done. It's always been within you, and it's been really, I suppose, in some ways, the backbone of Soul to Soul that's carried you through, along with the music.
Well, yeah. Again, it was like from an early age trying to find a way of monetizing and being responsible for yourself. I'd seen a lot through my brothers and sisters growing up, and their level of independence. And in the community, you know, we had a greengrocers, Mr. Young shop. We had the seamstress, Mr. Stevenson, and stuff like that, and everybody else hustling outside of the betting shop and the pub. You know, there were a few of us doing things, and I guess that would have been picked up from other people in the community. And like I said, you know, I really wasn't really one for running up the street in the riots, but because Bernie Grant was my mentor at the time, I had heavy links with the community. And again, I guess I just able to see that little crack in the things that are gone. And being self-sufficient was always the fundamental thing that allowed me to talk and have a voice, because I wasn't under somebody.
But what made you different, Jazzy? Because Plenty Man had sound, Plenty Man were independent, but none of them were able to go to the level and the places that you were able to get to, because clearly it was, you'll tell me if there was some long-term vision when you started, but you know, you would have seen different sounds, different people playing out, different men having their own businesses, but you went somewhere else. So what do you think made you different from everybody else?
Basically, I had different ambition.
Yeah.
My ambition wasn't to be playing in a community centre. My ambition really wasn't to be back to playing in a club. on a level that all my peers had done. Because one of the most difficult things for I found growing up was when we listened to all these radio heroes, from Emperor Roscoe all the way to, you know, the other guys outside of Steve Walsh. You know, half times I went to Froggy's Club and we couldn't get in. I used to listen to Robbie Vincent every week, try and get in them clubs. Weren't allowing us in. Even clubs around the corner. It was very difficult for us to get in. And I guess it was hard, me being outside of these clubs, seeing my people as bouncers and always on the peripherals, hearing the music. And yeah, it was felt like Rapatakas Bacchus, you know, fucking everything up for us. And it was like, I had the experience about being around everyone from Barry White to James Brown and Fella and them guys. And these are all things that happened later, but were able to put it into perspective for me. We're having this one conversation with Mr. Brown, and, you know, he's telling us about, you know, there were times they were doing shows and couldn't go in the front door.
Yeah.
Don Taylor was my manager for quite a while, and he had a lot of experiences. He was Little Anthony in the Imperials. He was their valet, and, you know, I heard, like, you know, stories. I'd been around a lot of people post 1990 to hear all these stories, and often enough I'd be really confused because what had changed. So now we were going through the front door, but we didn't own the building.
Yeah.
You were doing this and then on lots of occasions when you talk about entrepreneurialism and stuff like that, and you look at people's stories, James Brown's and so on and so forth, sometimes what we don't realise, you know, what they teach you in the West ain't all of that, meaning that even he had weird ways of doing whatever he did and so on and so forth. There was no doubt about it, hands down. You know, he was an independent guy. You could say, you know, with a level of finesse and knowledge to get, you know, him and whatever was going on in the community. Now, you know, we don't always get it all right or whatever, but for me, that was a major, like, point in my life to realise, seeing my parents come up and all those other people and wondering, you know, they're always working all the time and it's like they're living so that they could work.
Yeah.
Then, you know, our communities, our families were quite big, and that's a whole nother domestic drama. But it's just coming out of the shackles of these things. And even within the world of the academics at that time, again, that was interesting. And the politics always played a role. And I say politics because
I was going to say, I noticed that you were very specific about using that particular word. I wanted to kind of pick you up and go, explain more, because
the politics was, you know, anything from, you know, the people making promises and stuff like that and luring you in, and then you're on this Ferris wheel you can't get out. And then all of us, the children of the Commonwealth, you know what I mean? There ain't no unification there, so how the fuck are we going to have any? Do you know what I mean? We're our examples. Yeah. And I guess really, again, ducking and diving, I came up behind the scenes as well. I wasn't always like a front person, you understand? But when I say that, I mean, my knowledge goes back to, I started everything at the beginning. So I guess you could argue part of the success or whatever, or the existence, is patience.
Right.
And it's knowing what you don't want, because no one knows what they want. See? And then all the rest of the things are for the eye, in terms of how you vision the eye is doing for the eye. So the collectively maintaining, taking the journey, getting to the destinations, refueling, and continue to keep on moving. Excuse the pun. So in terms of the philosophy, somehow in all that kind of rambling and mix up.
Yeah, but we're getting there. But in some ways, it sounds to me that you saw the sound system as the beginning of the journey, where a lot of people saw that as the end of the journey for them. The sound system gave you the opportunity to kind of go, okay, I've done this. I can now jump from here to there. Where a lot of people were kind of going, okay, I got my sound. I'm playing. I'm making my dollar. I'm good. That wasn't enough for you. Whereas a lot of those guys clearly were satisfied and didn't have that kind of inner drive and desire. Is that fair?
It's an interesting perspective. And again, I was watching people like Mr. Young, Dougie's, Suckle, and these guys, and then some of the bigger sounds. That's where our knowledge and journey was, outside of the few grocery stores and whatever, because somehow all the other communities seem to have a legitimate source of revenue, whereas like we were constantly hustling, and even in our own communities when we're trying to serve our own, it does feel sometimes now I grow up, it just feels like something is in the air to make us fight against one another, because there's no rational answer to it.
No, there is no rational answer.
And somehow there feels like it was always to keep us apart, So one has to lead by example, and in that, it's time. He makes the time. We're living in it. So these are things that I've come to conclude now at this point in the journey, see? And there's a lot of things that have changed, and the world has become a lot smaller, and with that, a lot more chaos and disbelief with the politricians and all the other supposed leaders. Because from what I can remember putting together in my mind a sense, hearing people like Curtis Mayfield and the teachers before that, and what they were saying, what they were talking about, against the backdrop of where I'm living in the present or what I go on around me. So I defend that in terms of my ideology and what I believe. And I guess also I got to the point and realised that Rome weren't built in a day, do you know what I mean?
It takes time to get there. But people like Curtis and Stevie and those truthsayers, that was where we were learning a lot of our things. That's where we were kind of really understanding what truth was.
Right.
Rather than just kind of seeing what was on the screen. And I know, certainly for me, music was a real educator.
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. And again, as a youth growing up, like I said, you smell your own.
Yeah.
You might have to go through a few different dishes to realise which is the one. But yeah, and then often enough, you're bound by what you're hearing and what you submerge yourself in within the realms of who and what you're listening to.
So let's talk about you. Obviously, Joe Rico's there, but then suddenly you decide you're going to rebrand, and you're going to rebrand into Soul to Soul.
Let's say it just got to a point where we were growing up. We weren't a youth sound anymore, so we couldn't play for shekels. And then we realised it's a business, and then you have to put money in, do you know what I mean? And we were putting all our resources in it. The sound system and that whole journey, for many years, we paid to play. So like they say about investments, you got to,
You're invested in
yourself, and so on and so forth. So these were all different ways of justifying the experiences that weren't so happy, were a little bit rainy and damp. But why did you continue? And I think that's what made the difference, is that, excuse the cliche, man put in the hours, fam. We put in the hours, and really put in the hours. It was a 7-day-a-week thing for us, and we weren't moaning. We that's all we know. People say, "Oh, that's hard," and this and that. We don't know any better. Do you know what I mean? So that's what it was like for us at that time, knowing that at some point, righteousness will prevail.
So again, that's a really important point, which is I'd love you to expand on, Jazzy, because one of the things that we know is we had to grow and we took our time. We went on a journey, and like I invested a lot of my time trying to get into the business. You invested a lot of your time to get into the business. There's a train of thought that a lot of kids, given the fact that we're on a very rapid, instant society where they want things now, don't necessarily want to go on that journey. What advice would you give to those kids coming through now that want to kind of be the next Jazzie B? In terms of having looked back on your journey and the hours that you put in, what would you say to them?
I've got to be honest with you, Adrian. It's a different time, fella.
No, it is a different time.
It's not, those values and so on and so forth, they don't really exist. We got rapid drying paint now. We got concrete and screed that you can put down. It does its own self-leveling. The gram.
Yeah. No,
I mean, so it's about adapting.
Yeah, no, I hear that.
I think it's more about adapting, and like how we did in those days, pre the 80s, it was adapting. Although, let's not get it twisted, I guess Soul to Soul in its entirety could have only happened here in London. And that was because of that level of innovation and creativity that exists around these concrete pillars, and the people that exist within it oozes out that kind of energy. And within that, that's what the vapors of that is what kind of keeps you going, because there's levels of opportunity. And possibly the rest is knowing what you don't want. And that may be the challenge in terms of understanding you're trying to go for this. How do you get there against, I'm trying to go there, that happened to me, you feel me? And then we are treading in new territory, which made it much more exciting. And I think somewhat of the journey, different levels of impact had a different effect because we hadn't been in that position before. And now, like I said, putting the hours in, I guess I'm here talking to you on a level which ain't as much different as yesterday and the previous years. And still, there's even, we're using our LED lights at the end of the tunnel instead of the candle blowing in the wind. There's a solid light now. It's like, right, may I get close?
Not that close, though.
Well, like I said, I come from an era we used to bun candle and it was a 3-day week, you know what I mean? Right. And now they're trying to change the bulbs in my studio for LEDs. And it's like, fuck off, do you know what I mean? Shed the light, and in shedding the light, it's a different kind of light now. So we're getting used to it. So I think in terms of my journey and us growing up was a particular time. And in that transitional time, we were moving from paraffin to central heating. So, they were all warm. It was different levels of warmth.
But that's my thing. Yeah, paraffin, central heating. But the underlying thing is there's still heat. And you still have to get that heat. And
but levels of efficiency. Yeah. So now I'm not going to pump gas or waiting for my brother with the
paraffin van to come.
What was I going to buy, pink or blue this week?
Well, it was always blue around my yard. Had to be.
So in that way, like I'm saying, with the central heating now, you don't have the mess. You don't have, all the other problems that go along with the paraffin and waiting around. Now you put it on a timer. Come in cool again, you know what I mean, and everything, all the moisture in the atmosphere.
But you still have to earn your right to have that, Jazzy, and what you do is because you have to buy it. You've got to be able to afford to buy it, and that for me is part of the journey. And you did your, there's that saying that 10,000 hours makes you an expert, and of course, the times are different, and there are probably shortcuts. But it's like an apprenticeship. You still have to learn your trade. You still have to understand what you're doing. You still have to understand the business. You still have to understand the mechanisms you're working
I
with
don't know.
and the
I
levers you
question
have to
some of
pull.
that, fam. I question some of that when I can just go online and get a plug in. I can go to my brethren and just lift a plug in and so on and so forth. So I don't know. Things are a little bit different now. And sometimes if we put a strain on the old structure coming into the new structure, you know, we're going to come across much more issues and problems. So really, the kids nowadays have to be the architect for their own journey and utilize the technology, you know, and the wisdom is around as well. But again, the youth are fearless and they know everything.
Which is what I love about them now.
Well, it's always been the way, you know. If you speak to our parents, if you're still blessed to have your family,
Sadly not.
look what they were doing at the time where you were doing, you started your journey and so on. People don't come into the world as big people. Everybody has a journey. So within that, like I'm saying, with the youths nowadays coming up and what's going on, for me is much more exciting than it is daunting because there's a lot more independence now, and I guess the field is a lot wider. And with, like, we speak about technology and what that's been able to speed things up as well. And it's interesting now because, like I said to the youth, it's only a number. You know, we could be in a room full of all different people from all different walks of life and so on and so forth. But if we've got one common goal to get to a particular place, I mean, you know, sometimes having no inhibitions actually helps.
Absolutely, 100%.
And that's part of the problem with the elders who have so many inhibitions.
But that's down to the conditioning that some of us have had, right? And but
we all are a reflection of our environment as well.
let's talk. I want to go back because, again, we talk about the 10,000 hours, and you did yours, but you weren't just doing that. I mean, you worked. You nearly became a PE teacher. You worked for the RNIIB, and you worked as a tape op. And there was a quote that I read that I wanted to kind of ask you about. You know, you talked about being in what you said was a hostile environment. You said it made me vexed in one way, but it made me see that there are parts of the industry that we're not taking care of because we always want to be so up front. It also hardened me.
Yeah, because I had the opportunity to take a basic job and do the basic things that people liked what you done, and I'd done the very basics very well, and that was what gave me that platform. So in regards to answering that question, it was almost like, you know, there'll be scenarios where people will come in and be shocked to see a black face in that environment. I used that to my advantage, you know. And
How did you use it to your advantage?
well, the fact that my identity was first and foremost, and maybe because I was raised that way, I guess I had confidence. So if you asked me to make a cup of tea, so be it. Mm-hmm. But if you asked me to jump, I would suggest how high do you think I can jump? And that was more the nature of it. Plus, in terms of the hostile environment, in those days, a lot of union musicians and stuff like that, we were... Nova was a studio that was known for doing adverts, right, and a little bit more geared up in terms of faster turnover and so on. So we worked with people like Hans Zimmer, and Bidu was one of our main clients, and so on and so forth. And
great orchestrator.
And all those people, I just ended up building relationship maybe because of the environment, and it was unusual. Yeah. So some people were on their tippy toes, and other people saw it as a good opportunity to let off. And on both sides, I guess I was able to cope. And, you know, at some point, Pat just gave me the keys to the building. And let's say the rest is history, because that's where all my dubs were cut. Right. That's where a lot of mistakes were made in that environment. Yeah.
That was your school. I
cut my teeth in that. Yeah.
London, we talked about London. We talked about we're sitting in the middle of Soho recording this, and we talked about Soho and London as being a particularly colourful palette for what you did and the colours that you used. Tell us about that musical scene at the time, because I know, kind of growing up, I'm getting a little bit older than you, but I mean, certainly there's so much that we absorbed during that time, and I'm sure that you were kind of soaking up the same thing. What are the kind of sounds and places and music we listened to in that era, just before you can't the real journey begins? And
Well, before setting out on my own, in the days of Spats and that lot,
right,
I would have had the picture already painted by my brothers who were going to 20s in Carnaby Street and all the other things that were going on at the time. You know, there were little areas of this particular place, you know. What would that have been? I remember them talking about places like, oh, shucks, this is what happened when you're old.
I don't believe that. I mean,
You know, there's a lot of venues and clubs, like from 20s all the way down to the jazz clubs and a particular scene that all of my brothers would have tapped into.
so were you kind of going to places? Because obviously in the West End there was 100 Club.
I didn't start coming to the
practice.
West End until I was a teenager,
Right, okay.
but I was living in a household with people who frequented all
they
of
were there all
these
the time,
places.
right, okay.
Yeah, so it was almost like you had a sense of it anyway. And we'd come to Carnaby Street maybe to buy a Fares or some kind of Slazenger top or a Lylan Scott or something like that, because we were all stylish in them days as well. So although that was the daytime scene, there was lots of times where you were just walking around, because maybe I didn't even have the ambition at that time to go into clubs and so on and so forth, because maybe I knew my lane because of me brothers and sisters and stuff like that. And meaning that, you know, obviously you're not as a little kid like that, but when George and them man, they started to do, you know, Andra Club and Spats and all that lot in the afternoon when we used to go to school, I guess you then meeting up with other members of the community, which led on to, you know, me being an avid follower of this gentleman called Steve Walsh. And then moving on with that, you had everything from, you know, George Powell lived round the corner on Fairbridge Road.
Halsey man, yeah.
Yeah, so we all kind of grew up together in that area. And again, that was the alternative, because growing up in them days, you had the Skinheads, Mods, Teddy Boys, then you had the Sticks, man, the Roots, man, and then you had the Soul Boys, the Jazz Funkers, and so on and so forth. So there was all these different tribes. And then you had places that you could frequent, some of the all-dayers, and then obviously royalty, where everybody would congregate from a particular scene. And again, you'd be exchanging and stuff like that with people from all over the place. And then by, you know, 1 a.m, you're somewhere in North London between Hornsey and Muswell Hill at a Blues. And then by 6 a.m, between 6 and 8 a.m, you're back on the van picking up the sound system from the different blueses that you either hired or lent the gear out to. And again, this is all part of your community. So I would have been, you know, in them early days, things that pop out at the parties in West London, particularly Moxon and Lawrence's parties. I used to follow a sound back in them days, Michael, Fresh Beat. Then you had, you know, you had the East London side of it, Rocker G and all those kind of sounds, Skanker and all them, man, they're doing their thing. And then you would have had Rap Attack doing their thing as you're coming back around North London. Then you had South as well, which had a little scene going on. But at the time, you know, West London was probably carrying the swing. And there, because I was still into reggae, you know, following, you know, some of the bigger sounds in them times. And then you had the emergence of a British sort of sound, attitude, against the backdrop of what was coming in from America and so on and so forth. And by that time, a few of the soul boys probably got jobs in independent record labels. So then you were hearing, you know, anyone from Light of the World to, you know, the Beggars Banquet stuff, Incognito, You know, Ron Carter with all the different productions and stuff that he did, Candidate, and so on and so forth. And these were all little pockets because now it was people that you were rubbing shoulders with at either Royalty or one of them sort of soul clubs and so on and so forth. It's all starting to come together, and then the relationships that you're building as you're growing up, and then you start, you know, from Cool Tempos all the way down to, you know, the different record shops. I mean, at the point where the bit I'm not talking about is me having my own shops and me having my own sort of world growing. It's because there's a inseparable link between the two things, because as I'm growing, that's growing, and maybe that was the difference because I was doing this full time.
Right.
Most of my other colleagues were doing it as a release, as a part-time thing.
For you, it was that was your day-to-day business. That was your world.
That was my whole world. Yeah.
Let's you know what? Let's get into it because we need to. What was the moment? There must have been a pivotal moment where the development of Soul to Soul just flipped for you. You know, we talk about whether that was. Got to talk about Africa Centre because that was just such an incredible moment culturally as well.
Maybe it just started off from the fact that, you know, even as a youth, Dade and I, we wanted to be the biggest sound system in the world. And it was more or less having the plot. How are you going to do that? You know, how you you'd be dumb and be the biggest sound system in the world. And I guess that was my challenge. And, you know, I came up with a few brave ideas, and probably the cleverest one was what we call releasing one of your dub plates and your specials, which meant that my idea of it was that if I captured a groove that every DJ can work with or would need to have it in their set, because at that point when I was coming up at about early 20s, before that, you played the whole night because we were sound systems. So you had that thing about, you know, you come in, build up, and so on and so forth. So sound system had selectors, they had mic man, they had all the different people in position. Come the pirate radio stations in the mid-80s, everyone was trying to make a name for themselves. And I guess we just kept the same ethos as a sound system. Although we were on pirate radio station, instead of promoting our individual selves, we were promoting the sound system and what we were doing. And I guess that collective effort made a difference in terms of when people would physically see you and all the things what they heard about, the look, the whole, not, you know, 360, we were living it. And I guess that also, again, our timing was interesting, but I think when people engaged in that and saw that it was a little bit more, and it wouldn't be everybody, for the 100 of people there, maybe 20 people take us serious. But that happened so many times that kept multiplying.
That's 20 and add 20, add 20.
Yeah, and that's where I talk about being patient and actually having a plan and getting from A to B. So my philosophy was the same like when you went to Killer Sound. You know, you had to select at the right time, play the right tune at the right time, and have your backative, you know, to brought the sound down. 90% of these things were pantomime because all of us knew each other anyway. Right. But that's my early experiences. What was the turning point? The turning point was moving from being a reggae sound exclusive to becoming inclusive.
Right.
And the inclusivity meant that we were now facing our audience and allowing the audience to be part of the scene that was going on. And then the penny dropped when people were taking the scene literally and it was their place.
Yeah.
That was when I think I knew I had something, when, you know, you were turning up and people were lining up to lift the boxes out of your...
so I could hear you playing.
Boxes anymore. I didn't even know people's names and stuff like that. It was really interesting. But again, and then, you know, our society and what we were living played a massive part, because I had come off of the backdrop of the 80s and squatting and knew a lot of things about these various things in our community and so on and so forth. And I used that knowledge as well to aid, when we started with the warehouse parties and why it was so significant for us to move with travellers as opposed to just being ourselves, which was the same idea of putting jewels at the front door rather than having, you know, black guys at the front door. It made a massive difference. It would put off, the Spanglers, and then at the same time, when the Babylon approached us or the situations, it would take a different slant.
The judge was there to kind of, to do his thing.
Well, I mean, and in that situation, if it weren't him, it was Mark or one of them. But what was interesting, we were all inseparably linked with the music and the drive and the desire. And that's what's important from what I'm trying to explain, which is all part and parcel of the happy face, a thumping bass for loving race, because it's our community, and the community is about the club, and we're in the club. We were able to be innovative and grow and exchange these ideas and rub shoulders with one another. And I really do believe that's more than 40% of the success of Soul to Soul, is that all of us being communally together and sharing like in the same kind of ideas. And at some point, different people are going to drop off. I mean, if I had a list of people who said, like, I'm totally crazy and off my nuts, you know what I mean? Because they didn't understand, what I was doing, or maybe didn't take it as serious as I did.
I can see there being strange people that wouldn't understand it, Jazzy. And the cynical would say, that's a great marketing ploy. That's a great idea. Just trying to package it up and sell it. Others who kind of were in that moment, in that environment, will kind of go, you know what? You're missing the point here. There's a real sense of community, the music, the family vibe, the ethos that you kind of got when you walked into an African Centre epitomised that phrase. And if you're on the outside and you didn't get it, then you just didn't get it.
It was perfect if you didn't get it, because we didn't need you there anyway. And that was half of the problem, even that transition between the reggae thing and what we were creating on a much more global scale. It was moving out of that regional mentality, being a bit more international. And we replaced the idea of international with being much more broad-minded, and the fact that it wasn't a place where you stuck up, you know what I mean? Because you couldn't lean on the wall, you know what I mean? Because, that's where people took their breath. And if you were on the dance floor and you weren't dancing, you had to fuck off, you know what I mean? So it was a very interesting thing. And that carried us through, even up until where I am today, kind of thing. Like, and again, it was like putting all that work in at that time, which, don't care what kind of talking or podcast, I ain't gonna give you my last key, you know what I mean?
No.
The basic, the basic of what we did is evident, and it's out there
100%.
and
people see it.
we've been blessed to be able to put the book Reflections of My Journey together, which took us 10 years to do, again, because the way we wanted it to be presented and so on and so forth. And it wasn't something we wanted to bring out that was just going to, take a one bounce and go on. Right. This is going to be like a kind of encyclopedia about all the things that repped us and maybe, the true meaning of what it was for me to get a life.